Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Sports Dadcast. I am your host, Bo Bingen. You'll notice I don't have a guest with me today. This is going to be the first of the solo pods, so we'll see how it goes. This week, what I'm going to do is break down the Packers-Vikings game that took place last weekend, the Packers' big win. We'll look ahead to the Packers-Lions matchup on Sunday Night Football coming up. And we'll do a little speculating who the Packers could potentially play if they do beat the Lions and if they do get into the playoffs as that seventh seed in the NFC. And then we'll finish up with a little bit of a breakdown on the college football national championship between Georgia and TCU. So let's get right into it. The Packers Vikings game last week, if you remember, the Packers were 3 to 3.5 point favorites at home against the Vikings. The Packers ended up winning this one going away 41-17. It was a little bit of an odd game to start. Neither team was very good offensively early in that game, but the Packers did get a kickoff return for a touchdown, which swung the momentum in their favor. Then they did get a pick six going their way as well. And it was kind of a runaway from there. So you could tell watching the game on TV, there was a different energy level in Lambeau, and the pressure was on. The Packers players knew it, and the fans definitely fed off of that. If the Vikings were going to win, they needed to be nearly perfect, and they were nowhere near that. The Packers defense in this one was unbelievable. As a fan base, we've kind of waited for this kind of passion and aggression from the defense all season, but finally got it in week 17. The biggest difference I saw was how the secondary played in this one. It was clear from the beginning that the Packers and mainly Johnny Alexander had a plan to make things difficult for Justin Jefferson. You could tell they were trying to bracket him when he was in the slot. When he was on the outside, they jammed him pretty hard. Sometimes they even knocked him down before he could get into a route, and I think it made a big difference. And it really changed the way that Vikings offense could try to operate. Jefferson finished with one catch for 15 yards, and I think that was a huge win for the Packers. It made things difficult on Cousins, and that could really be a blueprint on how you beat the Vikings going forward. You sell out to take Jefferson away, and you make Cousins distribute the ball elsewhere. And Kirk Cousins, primetime Kirk, showed up in this Packers Vikings game. Kirk Cousins went 18 for 31, 205 yards. He did throw a touchdown in garbage time, but he also had 3 interceptions, one of those that went the other way for a touchdown. Cousins was also sacked 2 times, and one of those he lost the fumble. So really rough game for Kirk Cousins. You got to give the Packers a lot of credit on defense for making things hard for him. A fun stat from this game was that this is the first time since the late 1960s in which the Packers got a kickoff return for a touchdown as well as a defensive touchdown. So it's been a long time since we've seen both of those in the same game. And Keyshawn Nixon, man, he really does give the Packers an extra boost on special teams, a much needed boost for a special teams that the Packers have really struggled with the last couple of years. So Rich Bisaccia, you got to give him a lot of credit. He's turned that around since coming into Green Bay. So big win for the Packers. Looking ahead, they play the Lions on Sunday night. Both teams coming in at 8-8. Sunday Night Football. The Packers are favored by 5 in this game, which I think is a little bit too much. If you ask me, I think it's too much for the Packers. But you got to see what the temperature was and how the things played out from an energy standpoint. You got to like the Packers in this one, and it appears Vegas does as well. Over under set at 49, so Vegas expecting a Packers win in which there's a fair bit of scoring for an NFL game. If you look at the weather, it should be relatively balmy. It should be decent at Lambeau at kickoff time. We're talking probably 25, 30 degrees. I don't think there's much precipitation in the forecast at this point, but obviously a lot of can change. We're taping this on Friday afternoon. A lot can change in 2 days here in central Wisconsin. So quickly a breakdown on the way things can play out in the NFC. There's only one seed available. It's that 7 seed for the playoffs. The simplest of the options is Green Bay. If they win, they get in. They beat Detroit, they're in. They are the 7 seed. But Detroit can get in if they beat Green Bay, and Seattle has already lost. Seattle plays in the 3:30 window on Sunday. So by the time the Packers game kicks off, the Lions and the Packers will both know whether or not the Lions have been eliminated, because if Seattle beats the Rams, they will have an opportunity to get in, and that will essentially eliminate the Lions. So Seattle can get in if they beat the Rams and Green Bay loses. Again, if Green Bay beats Detroit, they're in. So that game eventually will not matter if the Packers beat Detroit. So Vegas thinks Green Bay is going to get the win in this game against the Lions. If you want to look back at the game in which the Lions played against the Packers in Week 9, that one was in Detroit. The Lions ended up winning that game 15-9, but if you look at the numbers and you watch that game back, the Packers pretty much controlled the game. There was some situational stuff that hurt the Packers. Offensively, each team had 9 possessions in that game. They were equal on first downs. They were equally efficient on third down. The Packers ran 12 more offensive plays, but had accumulated 135 more total yards. The Lions had a few more rushing yards. They outrushed the Packers in that game, 117 to 106, but on 6 more rushing attempts. So it seems like the Packers were more efficient, both running and passing the football. And I talked with Mitch last week, and we talked about how the Packers' defensive pass defense this season has been surprisingly effective. Some of that might be that the teams have just chosen to run the football on the Packers more, and they've had a little bit more success that way. But the Packers' pass defense has been really solid, and Jared Goff in this game in Week 9 against the Packers at home was not very good. He was 14 of 16 for 137 yards, did have 2 touchdowns and an interception. So nothing spectacular from Jared Goff in that Week 9 game. The deciding factor in this game that I mentioned was situational football, and specifically offensively. Aaron Rodgers threw 3 interceptions in the red zone, and the Packers were 0 for 4 in the red zone. They did go for it on fourth down one time and didn't get it. So you could say 4 turnovers in the red zone. That's not going to get it done no matter what else you're doing on offense. Romeo Doubs did sprain his ankle very early in that game, so that kind of took away another receiver for the Packers. In that game, Aaron Jones only had 11 touches, which I thought was a little bit surprising. 9 carries, 2 catches in that Week 9 game against the Lions. I don't think that's the case this week. Aaron Jones on the season averaging 5.3 yards per carry and 6.7 yards per catch. So very efficient when Aaron Jones touches the football for the Packers. He did have 16 touches in the game last week against the Vikings, but some of that was the way the game went. The Packers were up so much early that they didn't really need him to get the football a whole lot in the second half. There was an emphasis to get Aaron Jones the football early in that Vikings game. He did have 11 touches in the first half, and the first 3 games of their first possession did all go to Aaron Jones. So I would expect more of the same. The key for this one, looking ahead to Sunday night against the Lions, the key for the Packers is going to be their run game. The Lions have the worst defense in the NFL statistically, and the last 2 weeks they've given up 320 yards and 265 yards rushing to the Panthers and Bears respectively. So the Lions given up a lot of yards on the ground. If the Packers can run the ball consistently, control time of possession, and convert in the red zone, which they didn't do in Week 9, I think they can have some success. Now, my only worry for this game is the Packers' inability to create pressure on the defensive line. Joe Barry's not a guy or a defensive coordinator that likes to dial up pressure. He will sometimes bluff pressure, but he doesn't bring it very often. So that can be, a little bit easy to figure out. He tends to rush 4 and play coverage behind that and hope that the front 4 can get decent pressure. But the Packers, they failed to sack Goff in that first matchup. They didn't have a sack, and they only have 33 sacks on the season, which is tied for 24th in the NFL. So I know Rashawn Gary's out. Enagbari's been playing better, but he is still a rookie. It's been tough for the Packers to get pressure. I know they played well last week, but if Barry goes back to his old ways and tries to play off coverage, Jared Goff has had some success this year standing in the pocket, delivering the football downfield. I would like to think that the Packers being at home, being outdoors in the cool Green Bay air, the defense hopefully will be fired up again, and Barry kind of lets them play an aggressive style like they did against the Vikings. We'll see what happens. It's hard to deny that the success that they had last week, making things hard for Justin Jefferson. I think the Lions have a few more options offensively, but if the Packers play that same type of aggressive defense this week, I think they can make things hard on Jared Goff. Ultimately, I do think that the Packers play well enough to get this one. I don't know if it's the same kind of dominating fashion like it was last week, but I do think the Packers have ultimately get the win. Something to note, if you watch the Vikings game back, and maybe this is something I'm just realizing after I did watch a few more plays, playing outside in December, January in the cold is not something that every team can practice. You would think that the Vikings and the Lions can do so in preparation for games at Lambeau this late in the year, but there were a lot of Vikings players slipping and sliding around the field on Sunday, and a lot more than the Packers players were. And the broadcast even talked about how Justin Jefferson had gone through a couple of different sets of cleats during warmups and throughout the game, trying to figure out what would work for him. There was a play in which Kirk Cousins was intercepted and that Jefferson tried to break out of his route and just slipped and went to the ground. And the pass came in and he was laying on the ground and it went over his head and it got intercepted. So we saw that quite a bit out of multiple players for the Vikings. And it made me think of a game a few years ago in which the Packers hosted the Tennessee Titans and it was snowing quite a bit. And the Packers looked just fine out there. They looked like their footing was really consistent, and the Titans had nowhere to go. They were sliding all over the place, and they slipped plenty. And that was a resounding Packers win in that game as well. So I don't know if it's necessarily the same. But being at home, being on that field a little bit more, running, cutting, moving out of their breaks, it's an advantage, even if it is small. So the home field advantage can be a big part of this game, even if it means more than just having the fans there, your home fans. So I like the Packers in this one. Now, betting wise, I think this is a stay away. Now that the line is 4.5 or 5, I think that's way too many in a divisional game, especially if Seattle loses to the Rams earlier in the day. They are favored by 6 points in that game. So Vegas expecting Seattle to get a win over the Rams that have nothing to play for, but they're, other than just to play spoiler. So betting wise, I think this Packers Lions game is a stay away because you don't know really what kind of motivation you're going to get from the Lions, depending upon what happens in that Seattle game. I'm not willing to bet either side of this line. I think it goes up significantly from 4.5, 5-ish to maybe 6.5, 7-ish if Seattle does win and the the Lions are eliminated from the playoffs. We'll see what happens. I'm not willing to bet on this game. If I had to make a pick, I'd probably take the Packers and lay the 4.5, but I don't love it. I don't feel great about it. So if we look ahead, if the Packers are able to get in, if they do beat the Lions, they do get into the playoffs, it'll be the 7 seed. They would end up going to one of 3 places. They would end up going to Philly, San Francisco, or Dallas, the 3 different teams that are vying for that number 1 or number 2 seed. So it would be the 2 seed because the 1 seed would get the bye. It's looking like Philly will probably get that 1 seed. They're favored by almost 2 touchdowns against the Giants this weekend. So if that's the case, it would end up either being most likely San Francisco or Dallas. I don't love the matchup with San Francisco. I talked about that a little bit last week with Mitch too. I think that's a really bad matchup, especially for the Packers defensively, the way San Francisco can run the football. The Packers did beat Dallas at home this year already, but that was a game in which they were getting consistently beaten and the Packers kind of pulled it out late in the game, pushed it to overtime and then did get the win. I don't love that matchup either. But I think if you're a Packer fan, you have to hope that Dallas gets that 2 seed and the Packers end up going to Dallas to play in Wild Card Weekend. Rodgers traditionally has been pretty good in Texas and at Jerry World. So if that's something to hope for, you would hope that the Packers get Dallas, who's got a bit of a beat up secondary. So I think that's what you're hoping for if you're the Packers. But take care of business against Detroit and see what happens. The last time the Packers won a Super Bowl, they were the 6th seed and had to go on the road and win 3 games. And we'll see if they can do it again. It'll be interesting to watch, but they have to beat Detroit first to get into the playoffs, and we'll see what happens from there. So quickly looking ahead to the College Football National Championship, that game is Monday night, Georgia versus TCU. Georgia, a big favorite in this one, favored by 12.5. The over-under set at 62.5. If I'm completely honest, I'm not really sure what to make of this game. People have continued to discount TCU all season, and TCU has continued to prove them wrong. They were not ranked to start the year, and they're in the national championship now. They were, I think it was 200 to 1 to win the national championship to start the year. So huge underdogs. They're big underdogs in this game. So if I had to make a pick, I think I'm with Vegas in this one, expecting Georgia to win convincingly. I'm inclined to lay the 12.5, but I also was inclined to lay the big points with Michigan to beat TCU soundly. So I was wrong on that one. Not only did TCU upset Michigan, but there were times where they looked like they could run Michigan off the field. Michigan did make it a game, which was a really exciting game, but TCU did get the win. Georgia did not play well against Ohio State in their semifinal game, but they did end up getting the win. And my guess is that Kirby Smart brings the dogs ready to go. One thing I was surprised when watching that Georgia Ohio State game was Georgia's inability to get pressure consistently on CJ Stroud, and CJ Stroud consistently made them pay, moving the ball down the field. And this one was back and forth. So that allowed Ohio State to move the ball downfield in chunk passing plays. And if Georgia can't get the same kind of pressure on Max Duggan for TCU, He's certainly capable of slicing them up. And that Georgia secondary clearly was susceptible to passing the ball down the field, especially when Stroud had time in the pocket. There is one game you can kind of look at as what might be a comparison. There was a matchup between the SEC and Big 12 when Alabama played Kansas State in a bowl game last weekend, and Kansas State played well enough early. I think they were out to a 14-3 or 14-7 lead on Alabama. But Alabama eventually was too much, and they took control of that game, and they ended up blowing out Kansas State. I think the final score was 45-20. So if that's anything to look back on when you're looking at a Big 12 versus SEC matchup, and that's what you're going to get in Georgia and TCU. I think Georgia eventually comes to play, and I would lay the 12.5 in this game with them. And similarly, if it is a blowout, it's not really what we're looking for in a national championship. But there was early money on this game. It was Georgia favored by 14 to start, and the money got brought in on TCU to bring that line down. So the majority of the bets right now are on TCU, which makes sense. The public loves to bet on the underdog, the Cinderella story, but I'd expect sharp money to come in on the dogs, especially if this line continues to fall. So it might flatten out. Ultimately, I do like the over in this one. Georgia's been giving up a lot of points. They did in the SEC championship. They did last week against Ohio State. So I think this is a lock over, but we'll see what happens. I'm inclined to lay the 12.5 with Georgia. We'll see what happens. Hopefully it's a fun game. I would expect a Georgia win big. Maybe it's just by 2 scores, but we'll see what happens. That's all I've got for this week. Tune in next week. I'm going to break down all the NFL playoff games. It'll be a fun one. We're gonna wait and see what happens. We'll see what happens if the Packers can get in. But thanks again for listening to the quick solo pod, and I appreciate you guys taking the time to join me.